Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Ralston College podcast. Today we have the Cambridge classicist David Butterfield giving a lecture on the island of Samos, Greece, in the southeastern Aegean. Dr. Butterfield is a specialist in the poet Lucretius, among other things. He has been described to me as one of the finest Latinists of his generation. One of the things that's really amazing about him is his ability to sketch a history or a story of vast cultural developments. And that's what he does today. He tells the story of ancient Greece and indeed of ancient Greek as a cultural phenomenon or force that stretches through 2.5 millennia. That is a story of tradition, of upheaval, and of transformation. You might say it's the fundamental paradox of continuity, is birth and rebirth. I myself believe that our own cultural moment is in need of a kind of rebirth. And one of the questions is, how do we go about that? How do we return to the source? How do we revive and regenerate what is highest and best, or in our culture to apprehend those things that are highest and best that enable the realization of individual human potential? One of the things that for me is wonderful about this lecture is that in a way it is an example of going back to, as it were, drink at the source. Dr. Butterfield gave this lecture on a terrace overlooking the Aegean on the island of Samos to our students who were there immersing themselves in the study of Greek. We teach them Greek so that they have access to the words of Homer and of John and of Plato. And it's that going back to the source that enables us to make contact with the past such that it can illuminate our present. I mean, you can swim in the sea of Homer and of Penelope and Odysseus, and you can read the texts and the stories that arose at that time. And by doing that, you enable them to illuminate the present. It's a bit like a recipe. If your grandmother has a recipe that you learn to bake and to cook yourself, then in a way you're transmitting something that you've inherited into the present and then into the future. You might say that just as learning one of your grandmother's recipes allows you to understand and pass along an inheritance of your family, so too does the study and the reception and the spirited engagement with the treasures of the past enable us to illuminate both the present and the future. I believe that's a burden and a privilege we all have. All that is to say that in Dr. Butterfield's lecture today, you'll hear him argue that Greece and Greek is not just a phenomenon contained to the ancient world or to the shores of the Aegean, but one that stretches all the way into the present. And in fact, I think if you listen carefully, you'll hear the waves of that Aegean lapping up against the shore in this very lecture. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for tonight's seminar. If only we could do something about the background, we'd be set. I'd like to welcome some visitors tonight. Before I introduce our distinguished visiting speaker, I think Jason Baxter is here from Notre Dame in the back. You'll be seeing him around for the next few days. I think our friend Alex Petkus is here. I encourage you to take every opportunity your studies afford you to get to know them both and get a sense of the many things they know about. It is really an enormous pleasure and privilege for me to introduce Dr. David Butterfield this evening, a friend, a great scholar. He is a lecturer in classics at the University of Cambridge, where he specializes in Latin literature and textual criticism, and in the philosophy of Lucretius. He has been described to me by someone who is widely recognized to be one of the world's foremost classicists as the greatest Latinist of his generation. He is also the animating spirit of the widely followed and beautifully constructed website Antigone, which does so much to make the classical world and its history, its texts, its languages accessible to a very wide audience. I'm sure many of you know it. If you don't, I'd encourage you to not only to explore it yourself, but to see it as a paradigm for what it means to make old things sing in a way that can be heard today. Finally, I would simply like to say that Dr. Butterfield is a formidable scholar and intellect. The things he knows about are vastly wide-ranging, from the geology of Samos to the hills of Scotland to, of course, the whole range of Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, and so on. He's also a man of intellectual courage and a friend to all those who seek the higher things. Dr. Butterfield will be speaking to us tonight. I think the title of his talk, informally, as he's just given it to me, is From Homer to Gutenberg. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Stephen. An absurdly generous and indeed hyperbolic introduction to me. I am indeed a man of the same name, serving the same job, but some of those accolades are, I believe, beyond my grasp. But it's extremely exciting for me to be in your midst, not just for this talk and seminar that's going to happen, but in terms of the experiment that you are live partakers in at present. And it's quite an astounding experiment. Not only immersion in Greek-speaking life to learn Greek better, but this remarkable attempt to unify the early phases of Greek and its modern living form as part of a single continuum. It may seem obvious that modern Greek, having come from classical Greek, is one and the same language seen over time, but actually pedagogically, very few people in the world have tried to link the modern with the past in the way that Joe and the team are doing. And it's been so exciting for me to see that in action. So it would be an easier talk for me this evening to keep our focus within the Greek-speaking world and to say something largely Hellenic in its focus. In a sense, I am going to do that, but to do it properly, I will have to leave Greece and we will have to tour around large amounts of Europe as well as some of Northern Africa in the process. So my absurdly ambitious, but hopefully deliverable goal over the next 40 minutes or so is to tell the tale of how ancient Greece gets into the Renaissance in a way not just that means it's been preserved, but that it's valued and seen as integral to the West as a whole at that time and in the half millennium since then, okay? So to set one thing to one side, it is true that within that continuum of Greek-speaking culture, the Greeks, left to themselves, albeit with some interference from the Romans and the Ottomans and various external factors, have indeed preserved a core element of Greek literature and, as it follows, Greek culture on their own terms in their own language. And that's why what you're learning is so important on this course. But it's untrue to say that we now in the West, and we since the Renaissance, treat Greek culture as so integral and so important to our lives because of that mere fact of preservation within the Greek-speaking world. So if you'll forgive me and give me some indulgence to leave Greece behind, I'm going to go on a bit of a wander, which will cover, 2,500 years in about 40 minutes, which I think is something like a year every second. So strap in. So where to begin? The obvious place to begin is with writing. Writing is something we regard as completely part of the air around us. It's the bread and butter of what it is to be cultured and to share ideas. But it's a recent technology in terms of the West. Yes, there's pictographic attempts to instill ideas in the form of pictures going back 30, 40,000 years. But in terms of using a script, that's only 4,000 or 5,000 years old. We've got cuneiform, we've got Egyptian hieroglyphics. But for our story, it's the Phoenicians bringing out their own alphabetic scripts in the late 2nd millennium BC that changes everything for Greece and, in turn, Europe. The main thing that happens is that the Phoenician alphabet reaches Greece and therefore allows a complete paradigmatic shift of how Greeks relate to one another. But if we step back and think about it, if you're dealing with a culture that has no writing system, your modes of communication are only oral. And that sounds perfectly good. Speaking to one another is pretty much the most powerful way for us to commune. But you can't speak to someone if they can't hear you, which means in order to spread ideas, either they have to spread by word of mouth over land and sea, or a single person needs to tour and communicate as a wandering scholar, or you've got to hope that there's an unbroken oral tradition with big cultural memory to pass these ideas down. However, as soon as you can embed those ideas, whatever they may be, in a written form, and if that written form is able to survive physically, it follows that that is an almost infinite mode of retaining not just literature, but cultural memory and tradition. And those two words, which are so important to the Ralston mission as a whole, but are in fact important to all cultures around the world, are going to be extremely important in what I have to say. Those two words are tradition and culture. And both of those words are Latinate words, and there's no surprise as to why they are, because it's the Latinate tradition that keeps these ideas of handing over and cultivating a civilization alive through so many millennia. Etymologically, traditio is the handing over, giving, trans across to someone else, be it a burning torch, be it the baton, be it the message. But you're passing on in the belief that the receiver is equally empowered to pass it on. So that's tradition. As to culture, cultura, that's all about cultivating, perhaps even venerating, nourishing, preserving something, again, in the confidence that it matters and will matter to future generations. So these words which we take for granted are actually entirely inbuilt into what it is for us to look back at our shared past. That said, one of the things that I hope will come out of my talk once I get into the speed journey through time is that it's not all about conscious cultivation and careful canonical tradition making. Chance, circumstance, science, technological innovation, massive, surprising, destructive moments, and contingency all play major roles in shaping what we regard as our shared tradition. And unless we understand both sides of that coin, that there's an intent to preserve, but also what has been preserved has suffered both willful and entirely chance circumstances, we'll fail to understand properly where we've come from and where our cultures have taken their origins. So, back to where we were. The Greeks are able, from the 9th, 10th century BC, to start taking on this new alphabet to express their own language. As such, that means their long-standing literary culture of oral song, performance in the evening, huge amounts of memory to share these mutual traditions of art, are suddenly able to be instantiated in a fixed form, because once written, that is the form as per that book in question. And although that sounds a relatively trivial thing, it actually is hugely empowering for the author in question. It makes the actual performer someone you don't need to be in the room with, but someone whose name can travel far and wide and be enjoyed when that person is not just not in the room, but not even in the same part of the world. So from the days of Homer, in the 8th century BC, let us say, things really start to fire up. But it takes time to move from these heavily religious forms of song into prose and other modes of thought. And one of the things that may surprise you, if it's not something you've studied, is that for the first 2 or 3 centuries of philosophical, scientific inquiry, it's still the poem, written in verse in these technical meters, often with musical accompaniments, that is the natural medium for intellectual thought. It's only about 1 hour's boat ride from here, over in Miletus, on the western coast of Turkey, as it now is, that the first prose author released words from the confines of verse and started setting out ideas freely. Relatively late invention in the 6th century BC. So through the 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC, we of course have classical Athenian culture and Greece reaching its general artistic zenith in the ancient world. And you and I could talk about that almost infinitely, but we will leave the story at that point with the state of the book in the 5th century BC. So one of the downsides of writing taking over is that although it preserves a given author's literary construct, it actually has a high tariff, a high price for you to engage with it, because you need to be able to read. And again, being in a position to read, being able to make your way through often very complex texts is not a given. If we're raised in a shared oral culture, almost anyone can speak and engage with those cultures just by virtue of talking and hearing. But writing brought the classics into a more educational setting where you needed to be serious about reading and learning to write and learning to compose. And that's a slight shift, a slight intellectual movement in terms of where the ancient Greeks felt that art was nourished. At the same time, Greeks who wanted to spread their ideas, be it philosophy or science or mathematics or whatever it may be, are still taking advantage of the fact that the Greek-speaking world is covering an ever broader range of area. You might have heard of this term Magna Graecia, in Latin, Big Greece or Greater Greece. Well, Greek-speaking peoples had spread all around the Mediterranean, especially the northern Mediterranean, and Sicily, southern Italy, was a major Greek-speaking hub. And one of the most famous figures, if not the most famous figure of this island we are on, namely Pythagoras, left for whatever reason, as we might discuss tomorrow, left the island for Croton in southern Italy. And that was completely standard, that intellectuals of the day felt that they had to go elsewhere to reach intellectual hubs, now that there was a general, it sounds trivial to say, but a more serious attitude to how it is to put together thinking and writing and enjoying a literary culture which exists in textual form. So we've got roving scholars moving around the Greek-speaking world at this time, but elsewhere things are happening. Over in Italy, the Romans, who canonically date themselves to the mid-8th century BC, 753 BC is the date that they calculated, be it correct or crazy. But it takes the Romans a very long time to reach a similar point that the Greeks reached. By that I mean, although there's a written script for Latin for a long, long time before the 3rd century BC, it's only around 250, 240 BC where someone in Roman culture says that they're going to compose Latin literature. But they don't compose Latin literature. Instead, they write a poem in Latin, which is a translation of Homer's Odyssey. And that Odyssey is translated into a native Roman meter, but it's still a translation by a Greek-speaking slave. And it's surprising and often hard for certain scholars to accept that really for the first 100 years of Roman literary artistic output, it's driven by Greeks, either directly because it's Greek people who've come to Rome, or indirectly because it's Romans using Greek texts as their prompt. And this really is at the heart of what I'm going to be saying in what follows, namely that the Romans, from their literary origins, accept as fact that you can't do away with the Greeks. And more than that, the Greeks are in the intellectual lifeblood, they're in the waters in which you swim and from which you drink. And this is awkward for the Romans because in the 3rd century, early 2nd century BC, there's clear anti-Hellenic attitudes in Rome. It's seen as further east, decadent, even effeminate in certain ways, and against the sort of more hard-nosed, no-nonsense Roman way of living. And those are obviously crude stereotypes, but those are crude stereotypes in which the Romans spoke in this period. But despite the Cato, the elders of the world who want nothing to do with this Hellenic influence, facts are facts and wars are wars. And in 168 BC, the end of the Third Macedonian War, there's a battle in Pydna. Why should that interest us? Well, the Romans defeat the Greeks in 168 BC, but as part of their booty, as part of the prize of victory, they lead back to Rome roughly 1,000 Greeks. And they choose the pick of the crop, intellectually, artistically, culturally, as well as politically. And what that means is there's a literal convoy of the leading intellects of 2nd century BC Greece dragged and dropped into Roman life. And as soon as that happens, almost instantly, the Romans wake up to a new reality that the Greeks, who have the cultural cachet that Rome does not, are in their midst. And although we've lost most of the texts of this time, it's clear that across the full range of intellectual life, Greeks in Rome are now firing out that huge source of knowledge that they have. Now, there'll be things you'll know about and certainly have heard about, such as the Great Library at Alexandria down in Egypt, or maybe the Library of Pergamum on the west coast of Turkey again. But these don't have a great influence on Rome. For Rome, it's focused on its own expansion and cultural embedding of its own status as a player in the world of great literary traditions. And I don't want to denigrate the Roman tradition. I, after all, am devoting my life to studying Latin literature. But it is true that in almost every possible genre, almost every possible writer had a very deep and intimate contact with Greek literature before they even set about composing anything. And there's a very famous line of Horace now. We're jumping into the time of Augustus in the teens BC in his second book of Epistles. And Horace, this great figure, Augustus has taken him under his wing. He's effectively the voice of the early Principate, the early imperial period of Rome. He famously says, Graecia capta ferrum victorem cepit et artes intulit agresti latior. Relatively short sentence, but it packs a real punch. It means, as some of you may know, Greece, although captured her fierce conqueror and introduced the arts. And that doesn't just mean the arts in the narrow sense we think of them now. It means culture, everything. It introduced that to Latium agreste. Latium, Lazio, the Roman world, which was boorish. It was country bumpkin land. It wasn't cultured. It wasn't urbane. And here's Horace, the most urbane of poets under Augustus, the most celebrated of Roman emperors, saying, fair play. We did conquer Greece. Greece is now a Roman state, but they've always got the upper hand culturally. Okay. So we've now got around to the time of the birth of Christ, and we're moving into AD. And there's really only two things I want to pick out from that period, but both change everything. And without both, I am confident we would not be sitting in this place, let alone having classics departments in the universities around the world. Those two things are something as trivial as changing book technology and something as massive as Christianity being adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire. So in brief, I, in a rather blasé way, said, oh yes, writing comes along and then you've got a book. Well, what that means from about, let's say, 800 BC to about 200, 300 AD, so about a millennium, is a papyrus scroll. You'll have seen these things, you'll be familiar with them, even though they're rarely used these days. But there are some drawbacks with a papyrus scroll. The simpler one is that it's written in columns. It might be 30 foot long, and you roll it as you go like this. You're moving from left to right, and you're rolling column by column from one side to another. Get to the end, you've probably got to rewind it, like the old VHSs, put it back in the library, whatever. But that means it's not very convenient technology if you want to check a reference. If you want to quote someone from the very middle of, 10 meters of papyrus, it's a pain to find it, which means citation by memory was standard for most of the cultures of the Greek and Roman world. The far, far bigger problem, and it's a problem that has had classical scholars banging their heads against the wall for millennia, is that papyrus, once you take it out of Egypt and bring it into Europe, is a useful, that's the exact opposite of what I want to say. It's a useless, awful material to survive a European climate. It's simply factually, once exposed to oxygen and exposed to damp, which will happen even in Greece over a period of time, it decays. Papyrus scrolls cannot survive 2,000 years, let alone 3,000 years, in our climate. Now, you'll have heard of papyrus fragments. Yes, look more closely at them, and they've either been buried under sand where there's no oxidization, there's no damp, so they've been preserved largely in North Africa, or something awkward like a volcano sending a pyroclastic flow down their way has instantly carbonized them and buried them under Herculaneum, which means we can somehow look at them. But both of these are hacks, workarounds to my core point that if you put a papyrus scroll on a shelf, didn't touch it for 200 or 300 years, it'll turn to dust in your hands. Okay. So what's the change? Well, for complex reasons, one of which appears to be Christianity, in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, the roll, or the scroll, they're the same thing, is replaced by something that we all take for granted. Many of you are holding them in your hands, namely a book where you have single sheets that are either folded, and then you put folded versions together, or you have single sheets like that, which allow you to close and open and to turn pages as you read. Who cares, one might fairly say? Well, if you have this technology, not only can you hold it in one hand and therefore do things such as make notes elsewhere with your other hand, but you have larger margins that you can annotate, it's lightweight and portable, and your relationship with literature instantly changes. But much, much more importantly, around the same time, it's worked out that because you're not rolling it up and you're just putting leaves together, we can use a different material than this papyrus we're taking from Egypt, and the Egyptians or Ptolemaic Alexandria are often awkward about releasing the papyrus, so there are supply issues. Instead, we can use animal skin. And if we use animal skin and stretch it out and make it thin enough, we can get hundreds of leaves, write on them in our clearest and best, most endurable ink. And as far as we know, even now, these books survive for thousands and thousands of years. So the Codex Sinaiticus, the most famous text of the Greek New Testament, that was written in the 4th century AD. And if you have the rare pleasure to have it in front of you, it could have been made, just a few decades ago in terms of how the page faces you. We don't know, as I say, will these survive 5,000 more years? Maybe. It's an incredibly durable material for preserving text, even in a damp, wet, cold climate like much of Europe. So that change in book technology suddenly allows texts written in the ancient world to reach us now. As we'll see, it doesn't really matter whether they reach us now by that form. What really matters is whether they survive to the Renaissance and to the printing press, to which I will hopefully come. The other element is Christianity. Obviously, that's an absolutely huge and, to many of us, life-changing matter, but it's going to be extremely important for what happens in Rome. This isn't a history lesson of any kind, but it is the case that things start to turn for the Romans in the 5th century AD. But in the 4th century AD, Constantine has made Christianity the religion of Rome in 313. And in 330, he set up Constantinople as his new capital further east in the Byzantine world. And it's completely shifted the power dynamics and indeed the religiosity of the Roman world from the Italian and pagan to the Christian and largely Greek-speaking. As a result of that, when in the 5th century, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths overthrow the Roman Empire, two things are able to happen. Number one, which of course we all know here in Greece, especially the Greeks among us, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire, is able to continue on its own terms. Fine. But in the West, if you're literally being vandalized by folk who have no engagement with and no desire to preserve either the pagan classical texts or the Christian texts, it doesn't matter if they're written on a good material if those libraries are going to be burned down or allowed to fall into complete destruction. But because Christianity is embedded, it is possible throughout the Roman Empire as a whole for new communities still to take seriously books and writing. And what happens within a matter of decades is that communities of monks, Christian monastic communities, as far away as the very northwest of Europe, out on Ireland, are able, with the empire retreating, to form their own communities which take the written word, which take scripture seriously. But they don't just take scripture seriously. They take Greek seriously for as long as is possible. The knowledge of Greek fades away in the Western Empire. But they also take extremely seriously pagan classics. They see that ancient Greek and Roman culture intermarried with the Judeo-Christian tradition in a way that doesn't allow you to separate them. It would be an artificial separation, and it would stop you understanding many philosophical and spiritual truths. One of the fascinating things that happens to Pythagoras is that he's incorporated and reincorporated by different waves of thinkers. And by the time we've got to the 4th or 5th century, Neoplatonism, as a Christian doctrine, almost treats Pythagoras, who lived 5 or 6 centuries before Christ, he's a founding hero to the Neoplatonic tradition. Pythagoras, Plato, various figures, Christianity, it's all one. So we're able to speed up our time at this point because once the monastic communities have taken seriously the book, reading, writing, and education in the 5th and 6th centuries, they are safe little pockets of civilization. From that point, we can really jump 500 years ahead. Not a lot's going to happen to change this story. The monks are copying, sharing, exchanging texts that are Christian and pagan. They are teaching local people and bringing them into the monastery. And even with a figure like Charlemagne, Karl de Grosso, whatever one wants to call him, founding the Carolingian Renaissance and being crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, that only intensifies the process I'm talking about. So things are safe until we get to the 11th or 12th century AD. And then it's good news further because the monastic communities which were separate from life outside their hallowed walled communities had for the most part stopped engaging with Latin and Greek classics. Yes, Latin was the language of the church, but attending church was a largely oral and sometimes artistic experience. It wasn't a textual, scriptural experience for most worshippers. But in the 12th century, two things happen, actually in the late 11th century. The first is that some monastic orders say, right guys, and they were mostly guys, we need to get out and about in the town and we need to establish ourselves among the people to bring the word out into the streets. That helps our story because that means being able to read becomes a matter of generally public interest and not private Christian, a sort of private interest. Secondly, something that's part of almost all of our lives on this balcony, the university appears. We don't really know why it does, but by the late 11th century, universities are forming in towns and cities. And these are civic institutions, yes, from a religious world, but they're forming communities of intellectuals and scholars independent of the monastic orders for the most part. And what that means is there's a sudden new injection of life into being able to read and write. And that gives a further broadening to this tradition and this cultivation of a shared inheritance, added vim and vigor for the next few centuries. It's only once we get to the 13th century that something particularly exciting happens for this story. Because if I am honest with you, although it's true that the Latin and the Greek classics which lie behind the Latin classics are widely read among these communities, they are still treated as pagan, and by virtue of being pre-Christian, many of them are dismissed as anti-Christian, heretical. There are some interesting exceptions to this. Virgil, for one, the great Roman epic poet, is reanalyzed as a sort of Christian sage by many readers. And even Ovid, who writes about sex and love almost at every turn, he's repurposed in a moralized form as a man who actually, it was all just a bit of a joke. He was a good Christian deep down. But given all of that sort of allegorical reading, it still does remain the case that there's a very serious hierarchy between the Christian classics and the Latin classics. But meanwhile, in North Africa, things have been happening outside the tale I've told so far. And fundamentally, the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century AD starts to take seriously in the Arabic-speaking world engagement with Greek learning. Romans aren't on radar, Latin literature isn't on radar yet, but there's a clear decision, it's political and cultural as well as intellectual, to start translating into Arabic important Greek works. Most of those works aren't literary in the sense we understand now. They're more linked with science, astronomy, mathematics, that kind of thing. But it actually does cover a wide range of what we regard as the Greek classics. And what that means is leaping over Christianity back into pre-Christian Greece, a new route emerges for the Greek-speaking world to influence the wider world. And what's fascinating to us talking about Western Europe is that there's a feedback loop which goes along the North African coast and into Spain by virtue of the Moorish conquest of Spain by the Berbers and other Arabic-speaking people in the 8th century AD. And depending on which part of Spain we're talking about, there's 4, 5, 6, 7 centuries of Arabic-speaking intellectuals in Spain being scholars. And they're being scholars in a way that's heavily influenced by Greek thought. How does that concern us in the West? Well, as the Moors are pushed back and there's reconquest of the Spanish mainland by, let us say, Latin-speaking Christians, it's not as though Moorish intellectual life is pushed away. Instead, it's reincorporated. So works of figures like Averroes and Avicenna are brought into Latin translations, which then spread through the Latin-speaking empire. So just to underline my point here, although all the time on the shelves of the Greek and Byzantine world, there are the books that could revolutionize Western Europe, these are not being read by Latin-speaking Western Europeans. The Greeks, for the most part, aren't translating them into Latin and sending them into Europe, and the Latin-speaking nations, for the most part, are not visiting Greece, learning Greek, and trying to read them. But through this Arabic route, the text entering into Latin and then influencing figures like Aquinas, suddenly this Greco-Arabic tradition is not just in the air, it becomes mainstream. And, scholasticism under Aquinas is the dominant thing of the universities founded in the 11th and 12th centuries. So this second route comes in to re-inject philosophical and scientific vigor into Western European life. But this exciting development in the 13th century, with which I began before that tangent, is that figures start to look back to the ancient world on its own terms. By that, I don't mean they're reanalyzing the ancient Greeks and the Romans as proto-Christians who sort of were on the same page. Rather, they see that understanding the Greeks and Romans independently of Christianity is an essentially humanizing and rewarding exercise. And the major figures in this you will have heard of, but Petrarch, Francesca Petrarca, is the main figure in the 13th century who really, a man of unbelievable talents and energy, for whatever reason, really makes it his life goal to reach back to the classics. And again, there are people who could speak for days to you about what happens over the next 100, 150 years. But for our purposes, it is simply true that in Italy, where Latin as well as the vernacular Italian are dominant, the core feature of intellectual life, starts to spread from city-state to city-state the idea that if you want to be a good Christian and a good human whose self is at one with the divinely created world, classical learning is a fundamental part of that. And so this means there's not only a new injection of life in reading Latin literature on its own terms, but once you read Horace saying, well, the Greeks are constantly standing behind our shoulder as we write, well, it follows you need to know Greek. And we've had a period for almost 1,000 years in Western Europe by this point where Greek just can't be read. you'll have scribes copying a Latin manuscript, which has little Greek phrases in it, because the Romans were all fluent in Greek if they wrote Latin literature, and they would put in Greek words in Greek script as just part of their cultured life. But the scribes, never having been taught the Greek script, would not transcribe the Greek alphabet. They would simply write G-E-N-L. Graecum est non legetur. It's Greek. It can't be read. Okay? So that's where this phrase, you'll have heard it, it's all Greek to me, comes from. It's genuinely people in the West, at the very hearts of learning in Western Europe, saying, well, it's Greek, so we can't do anything with that, guys, can we? However, once the leap of faith is made in the 13th century, that knowing Greek is essential to the whole tradition that I'm talking about, things start to happen. In the simple sense, we have Greek-speaking scholars who are part of that unbroken tradition in the Byzantine world coming over to Italy, where they're now valued. They're able to teach people Greek. They're able to bring books, which after a bit of immersive learning like you're doing, would allow the great humanists of the day to read. You know, Petrarch would have given a right arm and both his legs and maybe the other arm, but not his eyes, to read Homer, okay? He could not read the works that were manifestly the lifeblood of the Latin literature that he loved. Moving a bit onwards, of course, we get to 1453, where the Ottoman conquest really destabilizes the narrative and ends the Eastern Empire in the Byzantine tradition. But that has a positive impact for the lineage I've been talking about in Western Europe, because increasingly large numbers of exiled scholars come over into the largely Latin-speaking world and really give it the force and the self-confidence to take Greek seriously. But to round off my narrative, I want to make a general point and then come to Gutenberg, with which my arc will end. And this is really a point about how serendipity and chance come into this tradition I've been talking about. Because we're not dealing with the perfect world, where the great libraries of the world could be amassed by the richest, but more importantly, most cultured figures. All the books could be there. We can simply copy them and then read them by the time of the Renaissance. That's not the reality. The Library of Alexandria is destroyed in various waves. We don't know when it was fully destroyed, but there is no legacy of that in terms of books surviving, okay? Similarly, Pergamon gives us the word parchment, that is writing on animal skin, but again, that library falls once the political support falls with it. And even the great libraries of imperial Rome, set up by various emperors, these don't meaningfully survive beyond the fall of Rome. But the really important thing is whether a given text by some unknown person in Rome or the Roman Empire more broadly made one expensive decision. And that was to pay to have the tatty papyrus roll, which his grandfather bought down the market, 100 years ago, converted at great expense into a parchment animal skin codex. If that transition was made, that book has the chance of getting from the fall of Rome into a monastic community. And if it does that, it has a good chance of surviving to the Renaissance. But if it doesn't do that, if it is not turned into a parchment codex, and that codex does not get to a monastery, it's game over. And that's why we as scholars have to deal with this perverse situation where some of the most important figures, not just to the West, but to the world, who wrote books that changed all of the intellectual tradition of antiquity, we can't even read one book by them. It's just gone. Okay? Epicurus, I work on Lucretius. Lucretius is wedded to Epicurus. We have no surviving full work by Epicurus. We have some little quotations cited by other philosophers, and we have some carbonized papyrus, which is a nightmare to pick through bits of it. Similarly, Aristotle, arguably the most important intellectual figure of the ancient world. Yes, we have some treatises, but even the ethics, the two ethics we've got, we think these are his private notes, as opposed to a fully fledged, public-facing Aristotelian text. And it comes down not to decisions made by people at the macro-cultural level, but just the sorry fact that we didn't make the two leaps from scroll to codex, and then codex into a monastic community. So although it is true that people made canons, they made curricula, they made value judgments, they called things the classics, things being better and things being worse, even that does not secure the survival of a text. So to end, what it comes down to, if we are to spread classical knowledge from its 15th century state into the Western world as we've known it over the last half millennium, is whether there is a manuscript surviving on parchment in the 15th century somewhere that can be taken over by the new wave of technology. And that new wave is not revolutionary in the sense of putting words on a page in a book and you turn the pages and bind it together. No, that's the codex. It's the mechanization of the movable type which Gutenberg in Mainz in the 1440s creates in Europe. You'll see people say, and you'll read people say, that elsewhere in the world, the printing press already existed. That's true. But for our purposes in the West, Gutenberg, on his own terms, invented it. And once you had a mechanized way of reproducing knowledge, two things happen very quickly. One, it can be done in an exact format. Once you've set up your page, you just sort of repeat as much as you like. And secondly, the price comes extremely low compared to where really expensive animal skin books had been. Add into this Chinese influence through the Arabic-speaking world, through Spain, of paper to replace animal parchment, and by 1500, you've got a cheap, easily replicable, world-changing technology to spread the Judeo-Christian and the classical tradition worldwide. So I'll end there. We've got to the start of the 16th century, and the only missing piece that we sort of can infer from where I've got to is that once you have a culture that both respects the Judeo-Christian and the classical tradition in Latin and in Greek, and you've got a means of producing and circulating those texts cheaply to the general people, then suddenly it is realistic for the average person to be taught to read, taught to write, and to take education seriously. And that's the birth of the modern period. That leads to the Enlightenment, and that spreads the university spirit that has brought us all around in front of me this evening to sit through this admittedly rather rapid talk, but I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.